World War II was a conflict of such staggering scale and complexity that it remains impossible to know the intimate thoughts of every soldier who fought in it. The war stretched across continents and oceans, involving millions of men and women from dozens of nations, each bringing their own fears, hopes, and convictions to the battlefield. Yet within this vast tapestry of human experience, certain patterns emerge, shared perspectives that reveal how entire nations viewed their enemies. For Japanese soldiers fighting in the Pacific Theater, their perception of American forces was shaped by decades of cultural conditioning, nationalist propaganda, resource desperation, and the brutal realities of combat itself. To understand how Japanese soldiers saw Americans during World War II is to peer into a worldview forged by modernization, threatened by encirclement, and hardened by a warrior code that made surrender unthinkable and death preferable to dishonor. The story begins not in the 1940s, but decades earlier, during the transformative Meiji Era that lasted from 1868 to 1912. This period witnessed one of history's most remarkable national transformations. Japan, which had been isolated from the world for over 2 centuries under the Tokugawa shogunate, suddenly found itself forced to engage with Western powers who arrived with superior military technology and demands for trade. The arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry's black ships in 1853 had been a national humiliation, a stark demonstration that Japan's traditional ways could not protect it from foreign domination. The Meiji Restoration represented Japan's answer to this existential threat: modernize rapidly, adopt Western technology and organizational methods, but preserve the essential Japanese spirit and identity. The transformation was breathtaking. Within a single generation, Japan went from a feudal society to an industrial power. Railways crisscrossed the islands, factories rose in cities, a modern conscript army replaced the samurai class, and a powerful navy began to take shape. Japanese officials studied Western institutions meticulously: German military organization, British naval tactics, American industrial methods, French legal codes. Yet this wholesale adoption of Western technology and systems did not mean Japan became Western in its soul. On the contrary, the Meiji period saw an intensification of Japanese nationalism and a fierce determination to preserve what made Japan unique. The emperor, once a distant ceremonial figure, became the living embodiment of the nation's unity and divine destiny. Shinto nationalism intertwined with modernization, creating a potent ideology that portrayed Japan as a sacred land with a divine mission. This careful balance between Western methods and Japanese essence created a profound psychological tension that would shape Japan's trajectory into the 20th century. The Japanese had proven they could master Western technology, defeat Western powers in war, as they did spectacularly against Russia in 1904 to 1905, and claim their place among the world's great nations. Yet the Western powers, particularly Britain and the United States, never seemed to fully accept Japan as an equal. Immigration restrictions, racial prejudice, and diplomatic slights reinforced a Japanese perception that no matter how modernized or powerful they became, the West would always see them as inferior, as yellow-skinned outsiders to be contained rather than respected peers to be welcomed. This festering resentment collided with harsh material realities. Japan, for all its industrial progress, was a resource-poor nation. The islands lacked the abundant coal, iron, and oil that fueled Western industries. As Japan's population grew and its industries expanded, this dependency on foreign resources became an increasingly dangerous vulnerability. Steel and oil, the lifeblood of modern military power, had to be imported. This created an almost existential anxiety among Japanese military planners and politicians. Their nation's survival and independence depended on resources controlled by others, and those others, particularly the United States and the European colonial powers, dominated the resource-rich regions of East Asia and the Pacific. The solution, in Japanese strategic thinking, was expansion. If Japan could not rely on the goodwill of foreign powers to supply essential resources, it would have to secure them by force. Manchuria, with its coal and iron, became the first major target. Korea had already been annexed in 1910, but Manchuria represented something larger, a vast territory that could provide the industrial resources Japan desperately needed. The Guangdong Army's seizure of Manchuria in 1931, nominally in response to a railroad incident, but in reality a carefully planned operation, marked a turning point. The international community condemned the action, but Japan simply withdrew from the League of Nations rather than relinquish its prize. The message was clear. Japan would pursue its destiny regardless of Western disapproval. Throughout the 1930s, Japanese nationalism intensified dramatically. The military gained increasing power over civilian government, and those who advocated restraint or accommodation with the West were intimidated, assassinated, or marginalized. The Second Sino-Japanese War, beginning in 1937, represented an escalation of Japan's expansionist vision. China, vast and populous but weakened by internal divisions, was portrayed as the natural sphere for Japanese dominance. Japanese propaganda framed the war not as aggression but as a mission to liberate Asia from Western colonialism and Chinese chaos, to create a new order where Asian peoples would prosper under Japanese leadership. But the Chinese War, rather than being the quick victory Japanese planners anticipated, became a grinding, costly conflict that consumed enormous amounts of resources and manpower. China's sheer size absorbed Japanese armies, and the brutality of the conflict, exemplified by atrocities like the rape of Nanking, hardened Chinese resistance rather than breaking it. As Japan became mired in China, the United States began to respond with increasing alarm. American sympathy for China, combined with growing concerns about Japanese expansionism threatening American interests in the Pacific, led to a series of economic measures that Japanese leaders viewed with mounting desperation. The American embargoes on oil and steel, implemented in stages between 1940 and 1941, represented in Japanese eyes not merely economic pressure but an existential threat. Japan's military machine was utterly dependent on American oil. Without it, the Navy would be immobilized, aircraft grounded, industry paralyzed. Japanese military planners calculated they had perhaps 18 months of oil reserves. After that, Japan would be defenseless, unable to resist whatever demands the Americans might make. From the American perspective, the embargoes were a measured response to Japanese aggression in China and Indochina, a way to restrain Japanese expansion without resorting to war. From the Japanese perspective, the embargoes were a stranglehold, a slow strangulation designed to force Japan to surrender its rightful place in Asia and submit to American domination. Japanese military documents from this period reveal a sense of mounting crisis and encirclement. Staff officers analyzed maps showing American, British, Dutch, and Chinese forces surrounding Japan from every direction. Propaganda portrayed the United States as a hypocritical giant that had itself expanded across a continent, crushing native populations and seizing territory from Mexico, yet now presumed to lecture Japan about aggression. The Americans controlled the Philippines, Hawaii, and numerous Pacific islands. The British held Malaya, Singapore, Burma, and India. The Dutch controlled the oil-rich East Indies. The Soviet Union loomed to the north. In every direction, Japan faced powers that had denied it the resources necessary for survival. This narrative of encirclement became central to Japanese propaganda and deeply influenced how ordinary Japanese citizens and soldiers came to view the Americans. President Franklin Roosevelt was depicted in Japanese propaganda as the architect of this encirclement, a sinister figure deliberately trying to humiliate and destroy Japan. Political cartoons portrayed him as a puppet master, a warmonger, or even a demon figure plotting Japan's destruction. The narrative constructed by Japanese propagandists was that America, fat and complacent from its wealth and distance from danger, sought to deny Japan what it had taken for itself, the right to secure resources and living space. This portrayal of American hypocrisy resonated with Japanese audiences who remembered being excluded by American immigration laws and treated as racial inferiors despite Japan's modern achievements. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, announced as Japan's vision for the region, was presented as a liberation movement. Japan would free Asia from white colonial rule, creating a harmonious community of Asian nations cooperating under Japanese guidance. The British, French, and Dutch, who had spent centuries exploiting Asian resources and subjugating Asian peoples, were portrayed as the true aggressors, as were the Americans who had seized the Philippines and treated Filipinos as colonial subjects. Japan, in this narrative, was the champion of Asian independence, the one Asian power that had successfully modernized and defeated Western nations in war. The propaganda machine worked tirelessly to convince both Japanese citizens and the peoples of occupied territories that Japanese expansion was fundamentally different from Western imperialism because it was Asians leading Asians rather than white foreigners dominating yellow and brown peoples. This ideology of Asian liberation and Japanese leadership was inseparable from concepts of racial and cultural superiority. Japanese propaganda promoted the idea of the Japanese as the Shido Minzoku, the leading race destined to guide other Asian peoples. This wasn't simply racism in the Western sense, though it certainly contained elements of ethnic chauvinism. It was rooted in a complex ideology that combined Shinto religious concepts of Japan's divine origins, Confucian ideas of hierarchical relationships, and social Darwinist theories imported from the West and twisted to serve Japanese nationalism. The Japanese, having successfully modernized and maintained their unique culture, were portrayed as possessing both the technological prowess of the West and the spiritual depth that the materialistic Western powers lacked. Americans, in this framework, were depicted as spiritually empty despite their material wealth. Japanese propaganda portrayed American society as decadent, obsessed with money and pleasure, lacking the discipline and self-sacrifice that characterized Japanese culture. The American emphasis on individualism was portrayed as weakness and selfishness, contrasted with Japanese collectivism and willingness to sacrifice for the nation. Hollywood movies, jazz music, and consumer culture were held up as evidence of American moral degradation. American racial tensions, labor strikes, and gangster violence were highlighted to demonstrate that American society was fundamentally disordered and corrupt. As war became increasingly likely, Japanese propaganda intensified its demonization of Americans. Visual propaganda portrayed American soldiers as literally demonic, with horns, fangs, and claws, advancing to destroy Japanese homes and families. Political cartoons depicted Americans as gangsters, murderers, and rapists, bringing violence and chaos wherever they went. Some propaganda went even further, portraying Americans as cannibals who would eat Japanese prisoners, a grotesque exaggeration designed to eliminate any thought of surrender from Japanese soldiers' minds. President Roosevelt and other American leaders were caricatured as monsters, sometimes with exaggerated features emphasizing anti-Semitic stereotypes as well, as Japan aligned its propaganda with Axis partners Germany and Italy. This propaganda was not merely abstract imagery. It was accompanied by specific narratives and alleged incidents designed to prove American savagery. Accounts, some real and others fabricated or exaggerated, circulated about how Americans treated prisoners, how they mutilated bodies, how they showed no mercy. The propaganda created an image of Americans as brutal killers who followed none of the rules of civilized warfare, who would torture and murder any Japanese soldier who fell into their hands. For Japanese soldiers indoctrinated with these images and stories, the prospect of becoming an American prisoner was literally worse than death. When war finally came with the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Japanese forces achieved stunning initial victories. Within months, Japan had conquered the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and numerous Pacific islands. The vaunted Western powers had been humiliated, their colonial possessions swept away by Japanese military might. For Japanese soldiers and civilians alike, these victories seemed to confirm everything the propaganda had promised. That Japanese spirit and courage were superior to Western materialism, that the Western powers were paper tigers, that Japan was indeed destined to lead Asia. But as the war progressed and American forces began their counteroffensive, Japanese perceptions of their enemy became more complex and more fearful. The early image of Americans as soft, luxury-loving weaklings who would collapse at the first real resistance gave way to a grudging recognition of American military capabilities combined with an intensified belief in American cruelty and savagery. Japanese soldiers writing letters home or keeping diaries recorded their experiences fighting Americans with a mixture of fear, hatred, and occasional respect for an enemy who proved far more formidable and far more brutal than initial propaganda had suggested. The fighting in places like Guadalcanal, Bougainville, Peleliu, and Okinawa was among the most savage of the entire war. The jungle warfare was nightmarish, fought in oppressive heat and humidity, amid disease and decay, with little quarter asked or given by either side. For Japanese soldiers, the experience of fighting Americans confirmed the propaganda about American brutality while adding new dimensions of terror. Americans possessed overwhelming material superiority, endless supplies of ammunition, artillery, air support, and reinforcements that Japanese forces, stretched across the Pacific and dependent on vulnerable supply lines, could never match. The American ability to rain down devastating firepower before infantry even advanced was terrifying to Japanese soldiers accustomed to the importance of spirit and willpower in battle. But it wasn't just American firepower that frightened Japanese soldiers. It was the apparent American attitude toward prisoners and the dead. Japanese military culture, deeply influenced by Bushido, the way of the warrior, held that surrender was the ultimate dishonor. A true Japanese soldier would fight to the death or commit suicide rather than suffer the shame of capture. Death in battle was glorious. Capture was eternal shame not just for the soldier but for his entire family. This belief was so deeply ingrained that it became a self-fulfilling prophecy in the Pacific War. Because Japanese soldiers almost never surrendered and often fought to the death or launched suicidal charges, American forces developed a wariness and a reluctance to take prisoners even when the opportunity presented itself. There were indeed instances where American forces refused to accept Japanese surrenders, shooting soldiers trying to give up, sometimes because of language barriers or mistrust after instances where feigned surrenders had been used to launch attacks, but also sometimes out of pure hatred and revenge for Japanese atrocities and the brutal nature of the fighting. Trophy-taking became a disturbing phenomenon among some American servicemen, who collected Japanese skulls, teeth, ears, and other body parts as souvenirs. While this was officially prohibited and condemned by American military leadership, it happened frequently enough that Japanese soldiers were aware of it, and it reinforced every propaganda narrative about American savagery they had been told. Japanese soldiers' letters and diaries capture their horror at discovering mutilated bodies of their comrades, heads displayed on stakes, or corpses left in deliberately degrading positions. They wrote about Americans who would shoot wounded Japanese soldiers without hesitation, who would use flamethrowers to burn defenders alive in their bunkers and caves, who showed no mercy even to those clearly unable to fight. From the American perspective, much of this was the grim necessity of fighting an enemy who refused to surrender and often used wounded men or apparent non-combatants to launch final attacks. But from the Japanese perspective, it confirmed everything they believed about American barbarism. The Battle of Bougainville saw Japanese soldiers recording their shock at American firepower and tactics. They wrote about how Americans would blanket entire areas with artillery and airstrikes, seemingly unconcerned with the expenditure of ammunition, creating moonscapes where jungle had once stood. The psychological impact of such bombardments on Japanese soldiers, who had far less artillery support and were always conscious of conserving ammunition, was profound. Some wrote that Americans seemed to value material over men, that they used machines to do what Japanese soldiers did with their own bodies and spirits. This was meant as criticism, but it also betrayed a dawning awareness that Japanese spirit alone might not be enough to overcome American industrial might. At Peleliu, one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War, Japanese defenders employed new tactics, abandoning the beach defenses and banzai charges that had proven so costly in earlier battles. Instead, they created an elaborate system of caves and fortifications inland, forcing Americans to dig them out in brutal close-quarters combat. The fighting was so intense that American casualties were far higher than expected. Japanese soldiers defending Peleliu wrote about how Americans attacked with what seemed like reckless disregard for casualties. Waves of Marines advancing despite devastating losses, supported by tanks and flamethrowers. Some Japanese accounts expressed a kind of horrified admiration for American persistence, noting that the Americans they faced were clearly not the soft, cowardly enemy they had been told to expect. But this recognition of American military effectiveness did not diminish Japanese hatred or fear. If anything, it intensified both. The realization that Americans were formidable opponents who possessed both material superiority and a willingness to fight ruthlessly made them even more terrifying. Japanese propaganda adapted to these realities by emphasizing that this made the Americans even more dangerous, even more necessary to resist with total commitment. The narrative shifted from Americans are weak and cowardly to Americans are powerful demons who must be fought with every ounce of Japanese spirit and sacrifice. The ideology of Bushido provided the psychological framework for Japanese soldiers to make sense of this increasingly desperate situation. Bushido, literally the way of the warrior, was a code of conduct that emphasized loyalty, honor, courage, self-discipline, and acceptance of death. While historical Bushido was complex and varied across different periods and contexts, the version promoted by Japan's militarist government in the 1930s and 1940s was deliberately simplified and intensified into a death cult that glorified sacrifice for the emperor and nation above all else. Japanese soldiers were taught that to die in battle for the emperor was the highest possible honor, that life itself was less valuable than maintaining one's honor and the honor of Japan. This ideology created a vast psychological gulf between Japanese and American soldiers. Americans, while certainly capable of courage and self-sacrifice, came from a cultural tradition that valued individual life and saw survival as natural and desirable. American military culture encouraged soldiers to fight hard but also to survive, to return home to their families. The idea of deliberately seeking death or refusing surrender even in hopeless situations was, to most Americans, incomprehensible and even insane. But to Japanese soldiers indoctrinated with Bushido ideology, the American willingness to surrender when defeated was proof of moral weakness and spiritual emptiness. Japanese soldiers wrote about Americans with contempt for this perceived cowardice, noting how Americans would surrender when surrounded or wounded rather than fighting to the death. They saw American prisoners, on the rare occasions they encountered them, as objects of pity and disgust, men who had chosen shame over honor. This created a perverse dynamic where Japanese soldiers saw American military strength as purely material and technological, divorced from any genuine warrior spirit or moral foundation. The Americans might have better weapons and more supplies, but they lacked what Japanese called Yamato Damashii, the Japanese spirit, the essential quality that made Japan unconquerable despite material disadvantages. This belief in spiritual superiority over material power led to tactics that horrified American forces and reinforced their own negative perceptions of Japanese fanaticism. Banzai charges, where Japanese soldiers would launch suicidal mass attacks against entrenched American positions, often at night, screaming and wielding swords alongside rifles, seemed to Americans like senseless slaughter. From the Japanese perspective, these charges demonstrated courage, commitment, and the warrior spirit. Even when such attacks failed militarily, they were seen as honorable demonstrations that Japanese soldiers would never submit, that they chose death over defeat. The psychological warfare worked both ways. Just as Japanese propaganda portrayed Americans as demons and savages, American propaganda depicted Japanese as fanatical, treacherous, and subhuman. American soldiers learned to see Japanese forces as an enemy that couldn't be reasoned with, that would fake surrender to kill unwary Americans, that would rig their own dead bodies with explosives, that would fight to the last man rather than accept the inevitable. This mutual dehumanization created a spiral of atrocity and counter-atrocity that made the Pacific War particularly brutal compared to the European theater. Japanese military documents and soldier accounts reveal their strategic thinking in the face of growing American power. As the war turned against Japan, with defeat following defeat, the emphasis shifted from winning to making victory so costly that Americans would lose their will to continue. The thinking was that Americans, being materialistic and soft-hearted, would eventually tire of the casualties and seek a negotiated peace that preserved at least some Japanese gains. Each island became a killing ground where Japanese defenders would exact the maximum possible price in American blood, hoping that public opinion in America would turn against the war. This strategy reached its horrifying culminax in the Battle of Okinawa, fought from April to June 1945. Okinawa was Japanese home territory, populated by Japanese civilians, and its defense was seen as the dress rehearsal for the defense of the home islands themselves. Japanese forces, numbering over 100,000 troops, prepared elaborate defenses and resolved to fight to the last man. They mobilized thousands of Okinawan civilians as well, sometimes forcibly, and indoctrinated them with the same propaganda about American savagery that regular soldiers had been fed. Okinawan civilians were told that American forces would rape, torture, and murder them, that suicide was preferable to capture. The result was catastrophe. The Battle of Okinawa was the bloodiest of the Pacific War, with over 12,000 Americans killed and 38,000 wounded. But Japanese casualties were far worse. Over 100,000 military dead and, horrifyingly, somewhere between 40,000 and 150,000 civilian deaths, many of them suicides or murder-suicides where families killed their own children rather than let them fall into American hands. Japanese soldiers witnessed civilians hurling themselves and their children from cliffs, saw families detonating grenades in their midst, all because they believed the propaganda about what Americans would do to them. The soldiers who survived Okinawa on both sides were forever marked by what they experienced there. For Japanese soldiers, the battle represented both the ultimate demonstration of Japanese sacrificial spirit and a glimpse of the apocalypse that awaited the home islands if the war continued. Some Japanese accounts from Okinawa show a dawning recognition that the propaganda about Americans, while containing some truths about American brutality in combat, had also lied to them. Some Okinawan civilians who were captured by American forces discovered they weren't tortured or murdered but instead were given food and medical care. This created cognitive dissonance for some Japanese observers who had to reconcile the demonic image of Americans with the reality of American soldiers treating prisoners relatively humanely once they were clearly no longer a threat. But such realizations came too late and were too limited to change the overall Japanese perception of Americans during the war. The dominant narrative remained that Americans were brutal enemies who threatened Japan's existence and must be resisted with total commitment. Letters from Japanese soldiers in the war's final months show men who knew Japan was losing but who remained determined to fight to the death anyway. They wrote about their duty to the emperor, their obligation to their ancestors, their determination to protect their families even if it meant dying in the attempt. The fear of American occupation, colored by years of propaganda and the brutal realities of combat, was so intense that millions of Japanese civilians were prepared for what they called the 100 million deaths. The final battle on Japanese soil where every man, woman, and child would fight and die rather than submit to American rule. This was the psychological state of Japan when the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. The absolute devastation of these attacks, combined with the Soviet Union's entry into the war, finally convinced Emperor Hirohito and some of his advisors that continued resistance was futile and would result in the complete annihilation of the Japanese people. Even then, military hardliners attempted a coup to prevent the emperor's surrender broadcast. So strong was the belief that death was preferable to defeat. When the emperor's voice finally crackled over the radio on August 15, 1945, announcing Japan's surrender in carefully euphemistic language that avoided the word surrender, millions of Japanese were shocked into disbelief. They had been prepared for national death, not for capitulation. The American occupation that followed confounded many Japanese expectations. The expected mass rapes, executions, and enslavement didn't happen. General Douglas MacArthur and the occupation authorities, while certainly pursuing significant reforms including democratization, land reform, and the elimination of militarism, did not behave like the demons of Japanese propaganda. Japanese civilians discovered that American soldiers, for all their capacity for violence and combat, were also capable of kindness, generosity, and even respect. The cognitive dissonance was enormous, and it contributed to a dramatic shift in Japanese perceptions of Americans in the post-war period. But during the war itself, that transformation was unimaginable. For Japanese soldiers facing Americans in the jungles of the Pacific Islands, in the seas around the Philippines, in the skies over Japan, the enemy was everything the propaganda had told them. Technologically superior, overwhelmingly powerful, and brutally savage. The Americans were backed by limitless resources, driven by incomprehensible motives, and apparently willing to commit any atrocity to achieve victory. They were demons in human form, the ultimate test of Japanese courage and spirit. Understanding how Japanese soldiers perceived Americans during World War II requires entering a worldview shaped by decades of historical forces. The Meiji Era's successful modernization created confidence but also resentment at continued Western condescension. Resource scarcity created desperate expansionism. The American embargoes created a narrative of encirclement and existential threat. Nationalist propaganda created a worldview where Japan was the righteous defender of Asia against Western imperialism, while simultaneously promoting Japanese racial and cultural superiority. Bushido ideology created soldiers prepared to die rather than surrender. And the brutal realities of combat, where both sides committed atrocities and showed little mercy, confirmed the worst assumptions each side had about the other. The Japanese soldier facing American forces saw an enemy who possessed overwhelming firepower, who showed little regard for the traditional codes of warfare, who mutilated the dead and gave no quarter to the living, who represented a materialistic civilization that threatened to destroy everything that made Japan and Japanese culture unique. That this perception was shaped by propaganda, by cultural misunderstanding, and by the fog of war doesn't make it any less historically significant. It was this perception that drove Japanese soldiers to fight with such fanatical determination, that made surrender almost unthinkable, that turned every battle into a desperate last stand. The tragedy is that both sides were caught in a spiral of mutual dehumanization and violence that made the Pacific War particularly brutal and prolonged. Japanese propaganda about American savagery helped create soldiers who would fight to the death, which in turn created American attitudes and behaviors that reinforced Japanese fears, which further hardened Japanese resistance. Each side saw the other as less than fully human, each side committed acts that horrified the other, and each side justified its own brutality as necessary response to enemy barbarism. For the young Japanese soldier crouched in a bunker on some Pacific island, hearing the rumble of American naval guns and knowing that overwhelming force was about to descend on his position, all the complexity of historical forces and propaganda collapsed into visceral fear and determination. He believed he was fighting demons who would show no mercy, defending his emperor and homeland against savages who threatened everything he held sacred. He had been taught that surrender was unthinkable, that death in battle was glorious, that his sacrifice had meaning. He had seen evidence of American brutality in the mutilated bodies of his comrades. He had heard the stories, read the propaganda, absorbed the ideology that made this moment of terror also a moment of potential transcendence. When the American forces came, with their tanks and flamethrowers, their overwhelming firepower and grim determination, they met resistance that often shocked them with its intensity. They faced an enemy who would fight from impossible positions, who would launch hopeless charges, who would detonate grenades in final acts of defiance rather than surrender. American soldiers, not understanding the cultural and ideological forces that created such behavior, saw only fanaticism and madness. They didn't see the decades of propaganda, the resource desperation, the cultural conditioning, the genuine fear of what would happen if they surrendered, the complex mixture of nationalism, religion, and warrior ideology that made death preferable to capture. This gulf of understanding between Japanese and American forces was perhaps the most profound of the Pacific War. Both sides were fighting and dying for causes they believed just. Both were capable of courage and brutality. Both were caught in historical forces larger than themselves. But they saw each other through lenses distorted by propaganda, cultural difference, and the necessities of total war. For the Japanese soldier, the American was a demon to be fought with every ounce of strength and spirit. For the American soldier, the Japanese was a fanatical enemy who refused to accept reality and had to be killed rather than captured. The truth, as always, was more complex than either side's propaganda suggested. But in the heat of battle, such complexity was lost. The Japanese perception of Americans during World War II was thus a tapestry woven from many threads: historical resentment of Western racism, desperation over resource scarcity, nationalist ideology promoting Japanese superiority, Bushido codes glorifying death over dishonor, propaganda demonizing the enemy, and the harsh realities of combat that confirmed the worst fears on both sides. It was a perception that helped prolong a devastating war, that led to countless deaths on both sides, that created trauma that echoed through generations. Understanding this perception doesn't excuse the atrocities committed by Japanese forces or justify Japan's aggressive expansion. But it does illuminate how millions of ordinary young men were convinced to fight and die with such determination, how an entire nation was mobilized for total war, and how the clash between Japanese and American forces became not just a military conflict but a collision of fundamentally different worldviews about honor, courage, sacrifice, and what it meant to be a warrior. In the end, Japanese perceptions of Americans were proven both right and wrong in ways they couldn't have anticipated. Americans were indeed formidable, brutal in combat, and possessed of overwhelming power. But they were not demons, not interested in enslaving or exterminating the Japanese people, and in fact became partners in rebuilding Japan into a prosperous democracy. The tragedy is how many had to die before that discovery could be made. How much suffering was caused by mutual misunderstanding and propaganda-driven hatred. The Pacific War stands as a testament to the dangers of dehumanizing the enemy, of allowing propaganda to override human connection, of letting historical grievances and resource competition escalate into total war. And at the heart of that tragedy was the Japanese soldier's perception of his American enemy, a perception shaped by forces beyond his control, confirmed by brutal experience, and ultimately proven insufficient to explain the complex reality of the humans on the other side of the rifle sights.